1902, a mountain wrote in fire. The journals tried to keep the line. April 1902 taught Martinique to read its mountain. Mount Pelée stitched pale plumes into a calm sky and dropped ash like a patient hand turning pages. In Saint-Pierre, the Paris of the Antilles, ledgers still balanced, cane still boiled at the usine Guérin, and the harbor clinked with handsome hardware. Schooners, banana boats, a mail steamer with a brass bell that thought it understood time. Diaries began to notice what calendars never do. A bitterness on the tongue, wrote a schoolmistress, a dust on the lids. On the slopes, springs went warm and the Etang Sec crater unlearned its name. Fumaroles stitched and unsticked themselves. Birds chose other trees. Rain turned to gray grit that creaked between teeth. The Rivière Blanche ran hot enough to scald doubt. The bishop framed caution as prayer. The governor framed calm as policy. Election placards bloomed along the Rue Victor Hugo, promising order, as if order were something one could count like beans. In a notebook now scorched at the corners, the telegraph clerk penciled cables outward, La Montagne Grande, then crossed the line with a polite correction for tone. At dusk, lightning without thunder threaded the plume like stitches pulled, but not tied. Cinders pattered on roofs with the gentleness of rain lying. We keep school tomorrow unless the ash objects, the schoolmistress wrote, drawing a small square she labeled window and shading it darker than evening. A sugar worker who had never owned a pen borrowed one to mark the day. The smell is like eggs that have learned murder. Between breaths, the city decided, without voting, to stay. Windows shut against grit. Shutters learned the new weight of air. In the roadstead, a steamer swung on its chain and watched Pelée the way ships watch weather, professionally, with a superstition they deny. Night came early and red around the edges. Somewhere in the hills, a sound like a cart on cobbles moved where no road had ever been. On May 5th, the mountain rehearsed the end with a single act. A black gush tore out of the Etang Sec crater and sent a boiling lahar down the Rivière Blanche. It chewed the Guérin works as if sugar paid for ruin, smashed cranes as if they were toys, and hurled men and mules into the mangrove with an equality that abolishes payroll. The foreman's pocketbook, later found stiff as bark, holds 5 last numbers and a note that ends mid-stroke. Send. The smell of sulfur lengthened into a taste of coin. The air learned to itch. Snakes and centipedes fled the slopes in a living punctuation. Fer-de-lances, scolopendras. Rivers of motion that taught the streets to hop. Newspapers, in an edition printed gritty, urged composure. The governor, who had learned Europe's vowels, wrote proclamations that sounded like furniture, reassuring, heavy, indifferent to the floor. Refugees came downhill from Morne Rouge and Ajoupa-Bouillon with stories of ash that hissed where it landed, of night at noon, of bolts of cloth in shops turned the color of rain. A cart bearing a wounded man arrived white as a bakery, and when they brushed him off, he reappeared, colored again and very tired. At the observatory, a man with instruments shaped like opinions took readings he believed would teach fire to explain itself. His log, later puckered by heat, records tremors like a pulse that hopes to be regular again. In the roadstead, the steamer Roraima loitered with mailbags and Sunday clothes, her rail polished for arrivals. Toward evening, a hot wind ran down from Pelée and touched necks as a hand touches a fevered child. Lightning lived silently in the column. Small stones ticked against shutters. Chickens reconsidered sleep. Someone posted a notice in a doorway. Classes suspended until the ash decides. Beside it, the baker chalked a kindness. Bread free to families from the slopes, because ovens cannot be evacuated and still be honorable. By lantern, a notary took depositions. By lamplight, a mother stitched, then stopped. Needle paused in midair as the mountain cleared its throat again. The city that would not leave improved its reasons. Elections loomed. Warehouses promised wages. The bishop promised mass. The governor promised the harbor would shelter them if the mountain learned impatience. Men who knew boats better than hills nodded and called danger theatrical. Theaters, obedient, advertised a comic opera for the weekend, as if to bribe fate with chorus. On the Rue Bouilly, bakers sifted ash as if it were flour and discovered it was, in fact, a recipe for bricks. Lamps burned day long. Laundry learned to be gray. A chicken laid an egg the color of smoke and was applauded for accuracy. Journals multiplied like sparrows. A merchant wrote, "Pelée grumbles, we bargain," and folded the page around a coin for scale. The telegraph clerk, who now coughed between telegrams, sent outward messages trimmed to suit distance. To Fort-de-France, concern. To Barbados, curiosity. To Paris, composure. The line stuttered when the plume thickened, and the key printed dots that did not match any alphabet. Somewhere upslope, a crack opened with a sound like sailcloth tearing, then shut again to keep its secret. The observatory noted phenomena of great interest because science sometimes borrows the tone of a host who will not admit his guest is rude. Refugees from the North Quarter camped by the cathedral and told stories the city treated as bad manners. Stones rained, one said. The river boiled, another. Night arrived, folded small, and then unfolded across noon. A notary took depositions because paper, unlike people, tolerates contradictions. At anchor, the Roraima trimmed her steam. Children in the lycée copied a sentence on their slates. "We will not be moved," and giggled in the serious way children do when they are practicing adulthood. At sunset, Pelée wore a column like a judge's robe, and from its hem a darker fold tugged at the sea breeze as if testing which way a city can be carried. In a boarding house, a schoolmistress closed her window, shook ash from her cuffs, and added a final line to the day. "If tomorrow is ordinary, I will apologize to the sky." Dawn of May 8th drew breath like a bellows. Ash sifted with a silk-fine malice. A thunder that was not thunder murmured in the hills. At 7:50, light changed, went metallic, as if noon had been forged and set improperly in the sky. Roosters misunderstood the hour and grew quiet. The Roraima's crew stood at the rail to watch the crater boil its familiar theatrical broth. A minute later, the familiar learned speed. The dome split. The western flank opened like a book kicked by a giant's knee. A black, incandescent cloud took the slope like cavalry. It moved fast enough to shame breath, hugging ground, riding its own cushion of air, fire folded in ash, stones tumbling within it like the arguments of a god. Witnesses lived long enough to be wrong. They mistook wind for water, fire for smoke, time for something with mercy. The first first blast shaved masts and peeled paint. The second unroofed the town as if opening a letter no one wished to read. The third arrived with heat that burned lungs before skin could complain. Watches stopped at 7:52 and agreed with each other like conspirators. In streets now erased, ink boiled in bottles. Type slugs melted into punctuation that could only be read as scream. The prison's thick cell saved a man who would become a voice. The theater folded into its own orchestra pit. The cathedral reassembled itself as rubble with professional speed. Papers ignited where they lay and rose a little before choosing ash. On the roadstead, the Roraima burned to the waterline and sent messages no wire could carry. In the schoolmistress's room, a page turned by a wind that had hands and blackened the line she had written, "I will apologize to the sky." Then there was only a sound like cloth ripped across the world, and afterward a hush that disbelieved itself. By noon, the city was a study in char and silence, broken by metals settling to smaller ideas. Rescue parties from Fort-de-France rode through air that blistered thought and found Saint-Pierre translated into particulars. A street of shoes without feet, safes swollen shut with the importance they had preserved. Bottles of wine turned to green bullets. The harbor had boiled and then reconsidered, leaving fish pale as porcelain and boats tied to cleats that no longer remembered docks. They found the prisoner, burned, breathing, impossible, curled in a stone cell that had learned to be a kiln and yet not a tomb. He rasped a testimony that will always read like metaphor, darkness that burned, wind with teeth, a weight that entered the mouth and hammered behind the eyes. In a telegraph office fused to glass, the clerk's key lay under a sheet of blistered paper on which one last line, half written, half branded, could be read. "To the friend who survives." In the ashes of a parlor, they lifted a ledger whose pages had charred together at the edges and preserved, like fossils, sums that would never be balanced. Men marked survivors on cuffs when ledgers could not be found. A priest gave absolution to the general heir. At sunset, Pelée wore a red that painters would later consider too theatrical, and then, shamefaced, reproduce anyway. Cinders fell like slow rain, learning manners. In the roadstead, a buoy bell rang for no tide. The rescuers slept sitting up, as if the ground might still bite. They woke to a mountain in shadow that appeared reasonable again, which is a cruelty geology practices without apology. From ash flutter and rumor, journals emerged. A school book with 4 days of notes growing darker. The foreman's pocketbook stiff with numbers. A sailor's log crisped at the corners but legible where salt had argued with heat. People carried these pages as if they were small, reluctant survivors and set them under any remaining glass to keep the wind from editing what had already been paid for. Science arrived with rulers and grief. Lacroix came from Paris with notebooks that liked facts, with a moustache stubborn as a hypothesis, and with a word that would stay. Nuée ardente. He walked the runout where glass had softened and pebbles had learned to be one another. He lifted in his hand a brick fused to a bottleneck in a marriage the law would never permit. He measured trees plain to stumps, oriented neatly to the blast, as if instructed by a drill sergeant. He explained, gently and without consolation, that the cloud was not flame but fragments, that heat rides ash, that speed can be a temperature by other means. Blame arranged itself nonetheless. Officials had written calm, printers had set it in type, captains had believed in harbors, bishops in bells, merchants in ledgers, people in the mercy of morning. In salons far away, men who had not coughed ash debated prudence. On the quay here, boots blackened to the ankle discussed the price of decisions made in rooms with curtains. The rescued prisoner demonstrated his cell. The cell kept its temper and its scourge. A telegraph coil, turned glassy, refused to resume its former habit of obeying. Photographs fixed what could be fixed. Streets like charcoal drawings, hulls like bad handwriting, faces made anonymous by heat. The journals that survived grew into evidence. Dates, tremors, smells, ash thickness measured by thumb because rulers burn. The schoolmistress's book recorded, in tidy hand grown untidy, the days of dust and the decision to keep class, until the mountain chose otherwise. Her last page, half gilded with heat, ends with 3 scored words, no ink owns. We remain here. Lacroix copied it into his notes with a restraint scholars try for and seldom keep. He drew the new crater with a care that looked like devotion and, having named the cloud, admitted that names do not protect. The mountain, consulted by instruments, had nothing to add but steam. Now, Saint-Pierre keeps its rooms outdoors. Streets rebuilt where streets remembered to run. Walls kneel at polite heights. Doorways frame sky graduated in blues the old painters lacked. In the Musée Franck Pelée, a case holds bottles foamed with glass, a bell clapper smoothed by more heat than bells deserve, a watch folded open at 7:52, the hour agreeing with itself. Beside them, 3 journals. The telegraph clerk's with its branded half-line, the sugar foreman's with 5 last numbers, the schoolmistress's with her apology to the sky burned almost to invisibility. Visitors lean until their breath fogs the case and are handed cloths politely. The theater's proscenium frames open air. The prison cell survives like a cautionary proverb. Names are carved into a low wall that faces the bay and its useful winds. Pelée still lives behind the hills, trimmed now with instruments that blink like small, polite eyes. Sirens are drilled. Routes are signposted. Children learn the word lahar as early as they learned the word mango. Each May 8th, the town stands on the quay and counts backward. 10, 9, 8, and then holds silence where morning cracked. Boats idle with their engines in a listening slow. The mountain keeps its own counsel, as mountains prefer. Walk the terrace of the ruins at evening. Trade wind sifts the ash that will always be here, no matter how thoroughly brooms propose order. Far below, surf unlearns and relearns the same stones. Lift the glass of the case slightly with your breath, and you will fog for a moment the page that could not leave, the one that says remain and has, by miracle and failure, obeyed. No voices, only sea that learned heat once and remembers. The small tick of a museum clock that chooses 7:52 when it sticks, and the dry, almost cheerful whisper of paper, which knows how to survive us and is not offended by the duty,